I've done a separate video in the past showing how I add the borders, adding the sides and then a header and a footer. The challenge for this one is using a directional fabric and trying to get it in the right orientation. At this point, it's best to get your measuring tape out and check your measurements. But your header and footer should now include the width that you had of your quilt topper plus the width of both of the side borders. And then don't forget your seam allowance. Does that make sense? Using turquoise for my inner border, and I'm cutting 2.5-inch strips. I'm cutting 4 of these, and this is 44-inch wide fabric. If you need to lengthen your border and sew pieces together, there are 2 ways of doing it. That is to sew on cutting on a diagonal, like bias binding, or cutting straight across and sewing straight across. In this quilt, I've used both, and the reason for that is the cutting and sewing on the bias for the very busy patterned fabric made it more evident that I was adding 2 pieces of fabric together. It drew attention to that rather than cutting it straight across. As you complete each section, take it to the ironing board and give it a good press. I have a metre of this fabric, and the pattern design on it is so big that I won't have enough to pattern match the fabric. Like you might do with the wallpaper, but I will be able to get the direction of the fabric correct, and that's what I want to show you how to cut it and sew it. And I made mistakes. I want to show you where I went wrong too. And I want to add this really vibrant Kaffee Fassett fabric to my project, and this is a directional print, and I want to make sure I get the direction of this correct. So I'm going to show you a slightly different way of how to cut this before attaching it. First of all, I've ironed it, and you'll see that the selvage down one end and then a fold one end, and you'll see it's not cut straight. The first thing I need to do is cut that straight on my cutting mat. I'm going to pin the selvages together while I do that. Using my cutting mat as a guide, and I'm matching up the ruler with the marks on my cutting mat, and I'm going to cut that straight using my rotary cutter. This is now lying in the right direction for me to cut across the width of the fabric so that the pattern will show upright. And I want a 3-inch border here. I'm going to cut 3.5-inch strips. Marked the ruler with the 3.5-inch line on the edge of my fabric, and I use a dumbbell to keep it secure, so when I get to the top, this ruler doesn't slide. My side borders I'm going to cut from the length here, And as you can see, I'm just under 30 inches. Now, by the time I've got a seam in that, that's going to be too short with just 2 pieces cut together. So I'm going to need to cut an extra piece. So what I'm going to do, I've doubled it over, and I'm going to double this over again so it'll fit on my cutting mat, and I'm going to fold it in the centre here at about 15 or 16 inches. Let me show you. Now I've got 4 thicknesses of fabric folded at about 15 inches. As you can see, I've altered the top again, so I'm going to need to make sure I've got sufficient fabric there. I'm going to cut 3.5 inch wide borders of this, and I've cut quite a wide border off at the selvage. By the time I cut the selvage off, I'm left with a good piece to do string quilting or for postage stamp quilting. My Kaffee Fassett postage stamps, I cut it 1.25 inch square, so I can make good use of that piece. Now I've got a straight edge to work from. I'm cutting through 4 layers, and I've set my border at 3.5 inches. I've now got 4 pieces. I'll probably sew them straight across rather than on the bias, but by the time I sew them together I'll lose a little bit. I'm not worried about doing a pattern match. What I have considered is that at the top of the sides they've both got some pink and red in them, so at least it looks similar either side. So I've now got 2 widths. That's a 44 inch width and a half width. That will give me 66 inch wide minus seam allowance for the header and the footer. And then lengthwise I've got 2 30 inch plus a half. That's about 70 inches, isn't it? That's going to be plenty, and the orientation is correct. So from the metre I started out with, I'm left with a very usable square, and that measures about 22 by 30 inches. And I've got some scrap left over. A walking foot on for my own convenience. I am using my tricks to make sure I get a 1/4 inch seam. And I do recommend that you pin. As you can see, I've sewn this once and had to unpick it because I was going astray. If you make a mistake and you have to unpick, be very gentle with your fabric. Use a good quality seam ripper and unpick it very gently, because you're going to have to sew back into that fabric again. Well, I've sewn it and I've just come to the ironing board to iron it, and I've realised that this piece is on upside down. Now it might not be obvious to you because the leaves look correct, but actually the clouds are the wrong way up. I should have the dark part of the cloud on the top, so I'm going to have to unpick that seam and unpick this and redo it. It's really annoying. Don't do what I've just done. Once your seams are pressed, take it to your cutting mat and using a rotary cutter, square off those edges to make a really good 90-degree angle. As you can see, I've really made sure that I've got the fabric the right way up. The clouds are the best indicators, I think. And after ironing it, I've realised that it would be very helpful, because I'm going to pack this away for a while until I can come back and quilt it. I'm going to leave the top in so I know which way's upright, and the top left-hand corner when I come to quilt this. But I'm quite pleased with that, and I hope you've enjoyed watching this video too. Come back and see me complete it at a later date, won't you? Thanks for watching. Bye.